And I talked to Sister Cheryl Christensen, who is, by the way, sick home with the flu, and told her I was teaching. And she said, well, remember to smile. So I'm going to do my best tonight, not to put you to sleep, and I'm going to try to smile for you, okay? I'm going to talk to you tonight. We're continuing the theme. Pastor has been doing some wonderful teaching on marriage, and I hope you all have learned some things from that. He's been talking about some wonderful books and things that would help with that. And so tonight I'm kind of expanding what we're talking about, not just marriage, but I want to talk about family. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the 4 E's of family excellence. And families and relationships is a subject I'm passionate about because that's my business, that's my heart, that's my ministry. And so I want to share some things with you tonight that I hope you'll find helpful. And many of the things I'll talk about, I could probably talk for hours on, but I'm going to try to keep it in the time frame here, okay? There is an African proverb that says, the ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its families. My version of that then becomes the restoration of a nation can begin in the homes of the families. When we as families can get our acts together, which means putting our families in God's order, then we can begin to affect our entire society. It's that much of an impact. There's a saying that goes, to live above with those we love, oh, that will be glory. But to live below with those we know, now that's a different story. Right? I remember an old Peanuts cartoon. Charlie Brown said, I love the world. It's people I have trouble with. And so here we are. God created us to not be alone. He created us to be in relationship. But in our relationships is where we most exemplify either Jesus or the world. And that's where we learn to be what we need to be. There has been such an increasing attack on families in past decades. Do any of you recognize that? The concept of family has been very brutally attacked in many different ways. Families are no longer just Beaver Cleaver families. We have many, many types of families. We have marrieds, we have cohabiting, we have blended families, some with young kids, some with teens, college age, empty nesters. We have singles, some never married, divorced, widowed, some with kids at home, some with kids grown. We have grandparents raising grandchildren. So there's a wide variety. We even now have parents or children being raised by 2 mommies and 2 daddies. And so the concept of family and the idea of family is very different than it used to be in the world. It's no different in God's economy than it always was. And that's what we want to look at. How do we get there? So in these 4 E's of family excellence, it applies to any family, whatever it looks like, that's wanting to walk in a godly excellence. Okay, the first 2 that we're going to talk about, and hopefully we'll get to all 4, but the first 2 can apply to both marriage and parenting. The third and fourth one that we're going to talk about apply mostly to parents and grandparents. So the first E is environment. Now, generally, women are considered to be the keepers of the home, whether they work outside of the home or not. They generally are regarded that way, and they help set the atmosphere in the home. Now, there's a spiritual atmosphere, and there's a relational and an emotional atmosphere in a home. Now, men, as the priests of your home, you're primarily responsible for setting the spiritual atmosphere of the home. And the women, We generally are the ones primarily responsible for the relational or the emotional atmosphere in a home or an environment. There's an old saying, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. Exactly. We all know that, right? And that's part of what I'm talking about, helping set the tone. And the atmosphere is so very important. Now, in my family, I grew up, I'm the oldest of four, and I always felt like I lived in a circus because there seemed to be so many of us. And I grew up in what I would call a moderately dysfunctional family. And we were pretty goofy in our family. Had a lot of fun, had a lot of other stuff. But I never really thought about the atmosphere. And then I remember when I first got into church, I was already grown, my kids were grown, when I found truth, when I got into church. And I remember the first time that I walked into my pastor's home. I was in Greenville, Texas, outside of Dallas. Scott McManus was my pastor. And I remember the first time I walked into their home, I have never felt anything so profoundly peaceful in my life. The atmosphere was so strong in the peace and the godliness, it almost knocked me over. And that's the kind of atmosphere that helps influence us in the right way in a home and what we want to go for and what we want to look at. Now, again, women generally set the tone in the household, whether you're living alone or living with other people. Now, I live alone, so I am solely responsible for the atmosphere of my home. It is a reflection of me and who I am and how I live my life. And when we live in families, we are each responsible for our contribution to the atmosphere or to the environment. We affect each other when we live together in profound ways. And many of those ways we don't even recognize or realize. Now, I'm not a medical person. I don't have any training in that respect. But I was told this, and it illustrates to me how profoundly we can affect each other. When they are in a situation of doing a heart transplant, a person has a bad heart, they're going to receive a heart from another person, okay? Now, when the diseased heart or the bad heart is taken out and it's still beating, they take the donor heart and they put it next to it, and they do not transplant that heart until they're beating in rhythm. Because initially they're not. They're beating at different rhythms. But they put them within proximity of each other, and at some point they begin to beat together. And that's when they actually can do the transplant. And that's a reflection of how we influence each other, even in ways that we don't even realize. It can be profound in the effect. Now, we can't control or guarantee how other people in our household are going to act, right? We like to think we can sometimes, but the truth is we can't. And we are responsible only for our own attitudes and our own behaviors. But it does create problems when we let other people's negative attitudes or negative behaviors affect us. It affects the whole home environment. And it's important so that we have good, healthy emotional boundaries so that that doesn't happen. It also has an effect if we have a negative attitude ourselves. Has anybody ever had a negative attitude? I mean, within the last 2 hours? But if we have that negative attitude and we let it spill out, it can affect other people in our homes if we don't have good, healthy emotional boundaries. Now, I've seen couples over and over in counseling that don't have strong emotional boundaries. So if one of them gets upset or angry or tense, then the other just jumps right in there and gets right there with them. Or if one gets down and depressed, the other comes over and gets down and depressed with them. And, children pick all that up. There might not even be a word spoken necessarily, but even pre-verbal children sense that and feel that kind of atmosphere, and it affects them. And it makes for a very unstable emotional environment in the home, and it sets up some real frustrations in a sense of being out of control. Now, how many of us like to feel out of control? We don't. So it creates problems if we don't know how to have healthy emotional boundaries here. Now, obviously, we are impacted by or affected by the attitudes or the behaviors of people around us, people that we live with, right? We're affected by that. But we don't have to let that drag us down too. Without good boundaries, what we do is we use other people's bad behavior as an excuse for our own. We yet let other people's sin be an excuse for our own. We say, well, he did it first. Well, if he hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have done this. But that's not an excuse, because I think that no one else's sin is an excuse for my own. We use the word dysfunctional today. And all that is a longer word for sin. We don't like to talk about sin a lot out there. And a lot of churches don't like to talk a lot about sin. But the truth is, that's what it is. And the same thing, I'm talking about emotional boundaries, healthy boundaries. The same thing, just as a side note here, is true in our churches. If we don't have good boundaries on our church family spiritually, doctrinally, standards, lifestyle, if we don't have a good sense of that as a church family, guess what's going to happen when these new converts come in out of the world? Our boundaries should be strong enough and solid enough that we affect them. But if they're not, what happens when they come in, or we get this rush, a revival, and this big rush of people, and they start affecting or infecting us because we don't have those strong boundaries. So we have to be very careful of that. So one of the things to ask ourselves, am I doing my part to establish a healthy, peaceful environment in my home? Or am I allowing myself to contribute to an unhealthy, chaotic environment? Now, Pastor talks a lot about, amongst the staff particularly, he says, what do you have in your bucket? Do you have water in your bucket, or do you have gasoline in your bucket? And believe me, it makes a huge difference. And the same thing is true in your home. If something arises or a conflict comes up or a disagreement, do you put water on it? The water of the Holy Ghost, washing and renewing? Or do you put gasoline on it? We are each responsible for those things. So the next question is, if it's the latter, if you have gasoline in your bucket, you're going to have an unhealthy environment in your home. And so the question is, why is that happening? It's time to evaluate. It's time to look at here. In our society, we tend to be blamers. Well, the reason I have this problem is because he or she does this or that. And so rather than looking at ourselves and accepting responsibility, it's much easier for it to be somebody else's fault. And when we say it's somebody else's fault, then we don't have any responsibility in it. But I believe a true Christian life is about personal accountability and responsibility. We are each responsible for ourselves. And we have to look at that in terms of the home environment here. I've taken a number of trips in an airplane. I bet most of you have too. Maybe different airlines going different destinations, different lengths of the trip. But there's something that's very consistent about it. You sit down, and what do? They start talking to you about what might happen. And they talk about an oxygen mask. And what do they say about the oxygen mask when it comes down? What do they say? Put your own oxygen mask on first. And that concept is what we have to look at in terms of taking care of problems in our homes. We have to look at ourselves first. Put on our own oxygen mask here. Now, in Ephesians 6 and 4, it says, "And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." That's a pretty familiar scripture. That's true of mothers as well. It says fathers, but it's also true of spouses with each other, of not provoking. We're not to provoke. So if things aren't going the way you would like them to go in your household, and if it's not the kind of atmosphere that you think Jesus would be comfortable coming in and sitting down and saying, "Pass the popcorn," then maybe something needs to be different here. There are some things to consider. So here are, I have a book called The Heart of Anger, and it's about parenting. And he has in here a list of 25 reasons that children are angry. And this really means more than angry just a moment here or there, kind of more of a lifestyle of being an angry child. 25 reasons. The number one reason that children are angry is a lack of marital harmony. When there's difficulties between the husband and wife, that's the number one reason that children become angry. Number two is establishing and maintaining a child-centered household. And what that does is when parents focus specifically on the kids, what the kids learn is that they're there, the family is there to take care of their needs and serve them and get them what they want and do what they want for them. And that teaches a sense of entitlement. Number three is modeling sinful anger. The scripture in Ephesians 4:26-27, "Be ye angry and sin not." It's not the anger that's the issue, but it's how we handle it. Anger can be there because it's a boundary violation. It tells us something has happened here. But it also says that we can handle it in a way that's not sinful. Number four is habitually disciplining while angry, scolding, being inconsistent with discipline, having double standards, do as I say, not as I do, being legalistic, as basically elevating household rules to the same level of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt go to bed at 8:30. Not admitting you're wrong and not asking for forgiveness. Constantly finding fault. Parents reversing God-given roles. God's order in a household is perfect order. When we have things in God's order, things work. When they're out of order, they don't. Not listening to your child's opinion or taking his or her side of the story seriously. Comparing them to others. Not making time just to talk. Not praising or encouraging your child. I love the way words work, because when we look at the word encourage, in means adding to. So you're adding courage. Encourage is to add courage. When you criticize or belittle or shame or any of that kind of thing, you are discouraging or removing courage. So what we want to be able to do is encourage. Failing to keep your promises, chastening in front of others, not allowing enough freedom, allowing too much freedom, mocking your child, abusing them physically, ridiculing or name-calling, unrealistic expectations, practicing favoritism, child training with worldly methodologies that are inconsistent with God's word. Those are some of the 25 reasons that we have trouble in parenting when our children begin to misbehave. But can you see how much of those could also apply in marriage? You just substitute the word wife or husband for child, and it works the same way. Now, here's one of the things that I know. I've been a counselor, licensed counselor for 36 years. And one of the things I know for sure in working with couples and families over those years is that if our needs are not met as children, if we've been rejected, abandoned, abused, um, shamed, etc., all of those kinds of things in our childhood, when we've grown up in a very dysfunctional family, then what happens is that our bodies grow up, but the wounded child in us is still there. And sometimes that wounded child takes over and keeps us from relating in healthy adult ways. And that wounded child in us often demands that other people take care of us and do what we need and what we want them to do. And that wounded child sometimes can be very persistent and even very demanding. We see it in our families, we see it in our workplaces, we see it in our churches. That's exactly what's happening. Wounded children grow up to be wounded adults acting out their pain. The truth is that hurt people hurt people. And so when you see someone who's being very hurtful, very critical, or very judgmental toward other people, what you can guarantee is that that person is a very hurting individual themselves. Now, they might not even recognize it, not even realize it, because often it's somebody else's fault. And that is absolutely not an excuse for anyone acting that way or being that way, but many times we're very blind as to why some of the things are happening the way that they are. We don't have that kind of insight into what's happening here. Does anybody know the definition of insanity? I think Albert Einstein said it first, but AA has taken it over. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And that's what happens many times when we get in these kinds of situations. We do these kind of behaviors over and over again. Every time we're surprised that they don't work and get us what we want. The truth is we have to put on our own oxygen mask first. We're the only ones that can do something about that. Here's a couple of things that I thought of that can help us move from perhaps a tense or a chaotic household, or not the kind of environment that you want it to be, to one that is more peaceful, more one that you would like for it to be. Number one, guess what it is? Prayer. Number one, prayer. We must learn to reorder our priorities so that prayer becomes more important than the chore list or the to-do list or other things that we think we have to do. That's praying for ourselves. That's praying for others in our home. And that's praying through the house on a regular basis. I believe in spiritual warfare. And the truth is, I believe that through this veil that we can't see, what goes on in that unseen world has much more of an effect on us in our homes and in our families than we would even recognize. Number two is plugging into Jesus as our source instead of expecting others, our spouse or our family members, to take care of us and make everything okay. If we're not feeling okay, a lot of times we're looking to our partners or somebody else to make us feel okay. But we say, if he would just do this, then I would be okay. If my wife would just do this, if she would do this, then I wouldn't have this problem. Or if my kids would just whatever, then I wouldn't be like this. And so we live our lives many times expecting other people to change their behavior so we'll be okay. Who is it that'll make us be okay? Jesus. He's got to be our source to do that. And we must learn to live integrated lives rather than disintegrated lives. In Psalm 86, 11, 12, it says, "Teach me thy way, O Lord. I will walk in thy truth. Unite my heart to fear thy name. I will praise thee, O Lord my God, with all of my heart, and I will glorify thy name forevermore." So it's talking about integrated or disintegrated. Again, if if you take the prefix dis off, you've removed the integration. So what happens many times in our lives, and what we're struggling with that wounded child and the things that we don't like, is that flesh part of ourselves. And if we let it rule over the spirit part of ourselves, we get ourselves in trouble. Integrated lives is the flesh and the spirit overriding and overcoming and guiding the flesh, right? That's part of what our journey is, to learn to be integrated. A lot of people live their spiritual life very disintegrated. In other words, my spiritual life is when I come to church, or if I read my Bible, or if I pray at meals. But it doesn't affect how I live my life out in the workplace or in my entertainment or anything else. That's a disintegrated lifestyle. But God asks us to integrate that so that our relationship with Him affects everything that we do, regardless of where we are or whether we're alone or with other people, right? So, with this, love must prevail. I found this a long time ago. It was the Focus on the Family magazines. And this woman had written this. This is from 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. And she wrote it from the perspective of a parent. And I want to read that to you. She says, "If I spend my days building skyscrapers with blocks, assembling cool stuff out of Legos, and creating relationships with other moms at Starbucks, but have not love, I have only the siren of the kids' ride-on fire truck, annoyingly stuck on hold. If I have the gift of knowing which child attempted to flush the Hot Wheels down the toilet and which one pushed her sister, and if I have faith that somehow we'll survive life's emergencies but have not love, I am nothing. If I save all my box tops for school and give outgrown clothes to the local shelter, and if I surrender my body to stretch marks and under-eye circles without the benefit of Botox, tanning salons, or diet bars, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient when someone isn't ready to use the big girl potty. It is kind when my husband has a hard day. It doesn't envy my neighbor who drives the new sport utility vehicle I can't afford. It is not rude, snapping at my spouse or children when things don't go my way. It is not easily angered or perceived or real injustices. It always protects the smallest, sweetest family confidences, always trusts God to provide my children's needs, always hopes in the freshness of tomorrow and the bright future of family, always perseveres amid hardship and doubt. Where there are sleepless nights, they shall end. Where there are diapers, Little League, and dioramas built from shoeboxes, they will cease. Where there is knowledge of baby care trends, discipline strategies, and boy-girl problems, it will pass away. Now these three remain: faith, lived out in my daily circumstances and instilled in my children; hope, of one day rejoicing with my family in heaven; and love, which covers over a multitude of less than perfect moments. But the greatest of these is love. It is what remains long after I'm gone. That's the first E. The second E is enrichment. So how do we enrich our marriages, and how do we enrich our children? In marriages, we have to be mindful to nurture the marital relationship, to nurture the marriage. That means creating a God-centered home and not a child-centered home. In the book I mentioned, Heart of Anger, he says, quote, "Children understand that the husband is the head of the family and the wife is submissive to her husband. Theirs is the primary relationship. It is permanent and exists to glorify God. Children have a secondary and temporary relationship." So that's one of the things in a marriage we have to keep in mind. A marriage is the primary relationship. Yes, your children will always be your children, even if they're 50 years old. but you don't relate to them the same way. But the marriage is primary. It means keeping the roles in the family clear according to God's order. It does not give, as the husband is the head of the household, it does not give him permission to dominate or abuse or control. There's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of the whole role of submission and authority in a family, and that could be several lessons in and of itself. But again, God's order is the perfect order. But it also means remaining friends with your spouse. Pastor mentioned just recently, I don't remember if it was last week or week before, about how many marriages fall apart after 20, 25, 30 years of marriage, because parents have spent so much time focused just on the children in a child-centered home and raising the children, that when those kids get up and are out the door and they're gone, they look at each other and go, "Who are you anyway?" Because they've not kept in touch and not focused on the marriage as primary. Now, I've seen it over and over in counseling, but marriages fall apart in different ways. They can fall apart very obviously to the outside world through divorce, and we certainly see a lot of that. But they can fall apart in other ways when a couple doesn't divorce, but they exit the marriage while still living together, but no longer act as a couple, because we can do that. Exits in marriage are many ways. You can exit a marriage by being a workaholic, getting addicted in some form or fashion, and many couples end up over the years with what I call a parallel marriage. They're walking together in the same direction, but they're doing it as individuals rather than as one, as God intended the marriage to be. And the only way for this to happen is to have a focus on the marriage as the primary relationship. It also means maintaining respect for your husbands, wives, and maintaining love for your wife, husbands, in terms of the love and respect that Pastor's been talking about. Ephesians 5:33, this is in the NIV version, it says, "However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband." So what do women do when the husband isn't doing it the way she thinks he should? Do we still show them respect? But isn't it more likely that what we try to do is correct them or nag them or show them how they should do it differently? How many have ever tried that? You don't have to raise your hand. Oh, some brave hands there, yes. Did it work? No, it doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because that's not our job. It's not our job to change other people. Whose job is that? It's God's job to change other people, not ours. The wife's job is to respect her husband, and if he's not doing things the way she thinks he should, she doesn't go this way with it, she goes this way with it. Because if she goes this way with it, then the Lord can work on it. Okay? So the same is true, husbands, when your wife isn't measuring up to your expectations or to some standard you have for her. Do you still show her love, even in those circumstances? Or do you try to order or demand or that she do it your way? Or do you find that cute little thing that thinks you're just absolutely Mr. Wonderful? That's what we do sometimes. We exit that way. That Love and Respect book that Pastor has been talking about can really be transformative for a marriage. It's not easy. Because as you remember, he says, who's going to go first in showing love or showing respect if the partner isn't doing it? Who's going to go first is the most mature one. And so it's not easy, but doing marriage God's way can really lead to the kind of marriage that God said is possible and that that's what we really yearn for. So let's look, we're still talking about enrichment, enriching our children or grandchildren. We enrich our children and their sense of self when we clearly value them as God's precious gift, rather than just an annoyance or somebody that's in the way. I remember when my kids were little, I was such a young mother and I was so clueless. I had been a babysitter since I was 12 years old, even with babies, very infants. And so I thought I knew everything I needed to know about kids until at 20 years old I had my first child and realized I wasn't going to go home at 11 o'clock at night and leave him in somebody else's care. He was in my care. And so it can be quite something when we realize that that's really the case and we are totally responsible for them. But we need to know and let them know that they are God's gift to us. When we let them know that they're valuable because God created them and because both God and we, as their parents and grandparents, love them unconditionally. A healthy grace-based message to a child says, I love you regardless of your performance. Now, I might not like what you're doing at the moment, and there might have to be some discipline, but my love never changes. That's consistent. But an unhealthy, shame-based message that's frequently given to kids is, I will love you only as long as you measure up to my standards of performance. And if you don't do it the way I want you to, I will shame, reject, yell, punish, criticize, nag you until you do it right. Parents rarely say that in words, but their performance or their interactions with their kids says it. We enrich our children when we don't let our own unmet needs, or that little child in us, wounded child, to interfere with our being able to meet theirs. So we help our children when we can be adult enough to be there for them and not let our own little wounded child take over. We enrich our children when we recognize our primary role as a trainer or an educator, and we're knowledgeable about God's stages of development. From the time of conception to the time of death, God has a schedule. And there are different things that have to be learned at different points in time. And so as a parent, it's very helpful to know what those are so that we're not expecting children to act like little adults. That we can allow them to be children, but we help guide their behavior and train their behavior. And we also not allowing them to be sexualized prematurely. That's happening so much out in the world. And I remember one time I had a 13-year-old in my office, and she was just furious at her parents for not letting her date. 13. And she says, I have 11-year-old and 12-year-old friends that are dating. And so when we go with the flow of the world in raising our children, those are some of the things that happen. We have 10-year-olds dressing seductively and wanting to wear makeup and high heels because it's out of God's order of development, and we need to be aware of that. So that is enrichment. The third E is equipping. Our primary role as parents is to equip our children. I'm reminded over and over again when I look at a brand new baby how vulnerable they are and how much they have to learn in these stages of development. And our role as parents is helping train them and guide them to give them a model to follow. The greatest model that I know of is in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. It says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine home, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. That says that every moment to me, every moment we're supposed to be teaching and training and shaping our children. And not only are we supposed to be doing those things in teaching our children, we have to walk the talk. We have to do as I say, because they learn as much or more by example than by the words that we speak. Our behavior as parents shouts much more loudly to our kids than our words do many times. Because by every interaction that our child observes between a mother and a father, husband and wife, we're teaching them about relationships. We're teaching them how to do marriage. And so every moment, whether you're sitting down with them and saying, now this is how you do it, we are showing them every moment how to do it. And we will either be modeling how to do it God's way or the enemy's way. I've seen so often in counseling parents bringing in teens that are not behaving the way they want them to. And a lot of times they bring them in kind of like they're a broken toaster, and they say, here, fix him. Call me when he's ready. And as I begin to explore that and look at the situation, what I find is that the kids are acting just like their parents. They're acting just like they were trained to act. When I lived in Odessa before I moved here, a partner and I had a life skills center, and we worked a lot with probated offenders. And we also went to Pecos, Texas. Anybody ever heard of Pecos? Cantaloupes? We went to the juvenile detention center there on a regular basis and worked with the youngsters in the detention center there. And at one point I was working with the parents. Well, the kids were in the detention center a lot of times for drug-related offenses, pot, different kinds of things. As I began to work with the parents and talking to them about parenting things, what I found was the parents were into pot, they were into this, and they were into that. And the kids were just the ones incarcerated, but the parents were doing the same things. And so that to me speaks so loudly of how our behavior demonstrates to our kids how to do things. And that we cannot have that kind of dual standard there. And if we as parents don't know how to do it God's way, then we have to put on our own oxygen mask first. We have to find out how to do that. In equipping, a question is, what is the first rule for teaching a parakeet how to talk? The answer is you have to have a larger vocabulary than the parakeet. The question, what is the first rule for disciplining children? The answer is you have to have more discipline than the child. So what this says is that we have to do some work ourselves. We have to be further ahead on the journey than our kids are in order to teach them and to train them and to help them navigate this journey successfully. We do not live in an easy world. We live in a world that's very difficult to live in. This society is very difficult to live in. Very high stress environment that we live in. And so it's very easy sometimes to let that stress get to us in such a way that we're not attending to the needs of our children and our family like we should. And in those cases, what we need to do is learn how to handle the stress ourselves more effectively so we can be there in a way that's helpful. So we have to be in our own growth and healing process to really effectively help our children. There's a difference between teaching and training, talking about equipping here. Training a child starts long before actual teaching does. The training of a child, and this is a quote from the book, the training of a child is the shaping, the developing, and the controlling of his personal faculties and powers, while the teaching of a child is the securing to him of knowledge from beyond himself. So part of what we're doing initially training is teaching children just how to navigate their own bodies, to have control over themselves, and to use the big girl potty when it's time. So we teach them, or we train them in those ways, and then we begin to train and teach them with information that helps them navigate the world and make decisions and choices of their own. There is the Greek word for discipline is, in the New Testament, is gymnazo. And that's where we get the words gymnastics and gymnasium from that, gymnazo. And it means to exercise or to train. And the gymnazo principle is to train by exercise. Or it's a habit or a practice that has been produced by continuous past exercise. Doing it over and over again, we learn. And using the concept, there's a concept of apprenticeship. We don't see that much in our world today, but it really is one that can be effectively applied from parenting, from the parenting aspect, training our children. I want to read just a little bit about this from the book. And this is the whole concept here of training our children. It says the gymnazo principle can be illustrated by the example of a blacksmith who is training an apprentice. Apprenticeships are not as popular today as they were during the early days of our nation, while Benjamin Franklin, for example, served as an apprentice for his older brother. Then it was not uncommon for the apprentice to live with, be provided for, and be subject to the master craftsman. An apprenticeship was a thorough, intense training that usually lasted for 7 years. Basically, it was training by practice, practice, and more practice until the apprentice got it right. The master craftsman would likely first explain and demonstrate the equipment. Then he would allow the apprentice to observe him going through the entire process of making a horseshoe, from lighting the forge to shoeing the horse's hoof with the finished product, explaining each procedure in great detail. After a number of observations, the master craftsman would allow the apprentice to help with some of the procedure. Instructing him, the master would allow the apprentice to try the procedure. He would correct him on the spot should he make a mistake and require him to do it again until he got it right. The master may have stood behind his apprentice, holding or gripping his hands over the hands of the apprentice, as they would hold the iron to the fire until the iron had just the right glow of red. Then, hand in hand, the master craftsman and the apprentice would quickly bring the iron to the anvil, and hand in hand, the master would demonstrate to the apprentice just where to hammer the iron and just how hard to strike it. Then he would put it back into the fire, and so on until the horseshoe was complete. After a few exercises of this hands-on training, the master would be ready to allow the apprentice to try the procedure by himself. Still standing behind his student, he would observe the apprentice's work, noticing every detail of workmanship. Then, as soon as a mistake was made, immediately he might say, "No, this way." Again, grasping the hand of the apprentice, he would show him precisely how to correct his mistake. That's the gymnazo principle in action. Imagine how it would be what it would be like if the master craftsman had simply explained the procedure one time. And when the apprentice made his first mistake, the master said, "Wrong, no dinner for you tonight. You'd better improve tomorrow." That would be cruel, unmerciful, and a violation of education, you say. Yet that is the way many Christian parents discipline their children. And so, I think of that in terms of how we say to our kids, "Go clean your room," and they go in finally whenever they do it and clean their room, and then we go in and criticize them for not doing it the way we think they should, because their idea of a clean room is very different than our idea of a clean room, right? Or cleaning the kitchen after supper. So this gymnazo principle in terms of training and teaching our children is actually walking them through the process and showing them and help them learn step by step, rather than just pointing them in a direction or say, go do this and go do that, which is often what we do because of the, can I say, struggles and stress in our schedules and the pressure of time that many times we feel. But that, in the gymnazo principle, parents train the children by showing them, doing it with them until they have learned to do it correctly. It says that biblical discipline involves correcting wrong behavior by practicing right behavior with the right attitude for the right reason until the right behavior becomes habitual. And that's what we want, isn't it? So bringing up children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, as it talks about in Ephesians 6:4, takes time and energy and focus. But the Christian character that is built into the lives of children has tremendous value, not only through that child's life, but throughout eternity. Because the way we build our children's lives has eternal value to it. So let's talk about the last E, the fourth E, which is establishment. So our goal as parents is establishing our children as responsible, God-fearing, and God-following adults. In Luke 2:52, it says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And that's talking about the four areas of development that are necessary: social, emotional, physical, and spiritual. And that gave Jesus a solid foundation to build his adulthood and his ministry on. And those are the areas that we as parents must affect our children and train them. So we have to both teach and demonstrate godly values and beliefs. That's what gives them a solid foundation to stand on. We need to teach them. I recently heard about a couple who was choosing not to take their child to church. They said, well, when he gets to be an adult or he gets older, he can choose if he wants to do that. So they were not exposing this child to anything, any godly value, and expecting him suddenly as an adult to go, oh, well, maybe I need to go to church. So that's neglecting that whole area of training and teaching there. Parents are literally in the job of building adults, and we will either build healthy ones or unhealthy ones. It says in the Old Testament 3 or 4 different places that the iniquities of the forefathers are visited unto the third and fourth generations, the sins of the forefathers. And that talks about the generational aspects of the sins or the iniquities. You know, if we look at how the Bible talks about iniquities, those are the things that are passed on generationally. When I do an intake on somebody for counseling, whether it's an individual or a couple, I tell them I'm just going to ask a lot of nosy questions, and I ask them a lot about previous generations, their parents, grandparents, things that have gone on there, because that tells me the iniquities that have been passed on and some of the things that are influencing them. And so those are important to know because those are things that get passed on. Here's something that I found in a book that I thought was just fascinating in the way that it demonstrates this. Here's the heritage of 2 different men who both lived around the same time in the 19th century or in the 1800s. There was a man named Max Jukes. He was a godless man. He married an unbelieving woman. They had 560 known descendants in their line. 300 of them died as paupers. 150 became criminals. 17 were convicted murderers. 100 of them were drunkards. More than one half of the women in that line were prostitutes. Max Duke's descendants cost the U.S. government more than $1.25 million. That's in 19th century money. Most of it spent on their imprisonment in an attempt to rehabilitate them into productive citizens. Now, compare that with Jonathan Edwards. He was a godly man, a preacher of righteousness. He married a godly woman who loved God with all her heart. They had 1,394 descendants, almost 3 times as many. 295 were college graduates. 65 of them became college professors. 3 were U.S. senators. 3 were elected state governors. 30 became judges. 100 of them were lawyers. 1 was dean of a law school. 56 were practicing physicians. 1 was dean of a medical school. 75 were military officers. 100 were well-known missionaries, teachers, and authors. 80 became public officials. 3 of those were mayors of large cities. 1 was the comptroller of the U.S. Treasury, and 1 became vice president of the United States. None of his descendants cost the U.S. government 1 red cent. Now, it would be hard to convince me that that was a coincidence. That is the power of the legacy. That's the kind of heritage, the kind of legacy that we can pass on in our families. What we do in our own homes today, day by day, interaction by interaction, affects generations. Should the Lord tarry, and there are generations. We've been talking a lot about legacy here at the church because that's the name of our new campaign, and you'll be hearing more about it. But think about that in terms, every interaction you have with your child today is contributing to that legacy. Every bit of us is a part of that. We determine our children's legacy by our behavior and our attitude toward them each and every day. Something I teach consistently is that it's never too late to learn something new and to do things differently. Even if you have older children, even if you're a grandparent, it's never too late to change the way or learn new ways to live and to live more successfully. To me, one of the most wonderful things to demonstrate that is that, as I said, my kids were grown by the time I got into church, and I remember one trip I took with my youngest son and his wife. They were newly married at that time. And we were going on a Thanksgiving trip up to Oklahoma to visit my parents. And we were taking turns in the car talking about things that we were thankful for. So it was Thanksgiving, so that's what we were thinking about. And it got to one point my son said, "Mom, you know, I'm really thankful for how you are now." He said, "I know that you're really different than you used to be. I can't really remember exactly how you used to be, but I know you're real different." And to me, that was such a blessing that God had given him amnesia about how I was before. But what a blessing that even at an older age, we can learn. We can learn something each and every day, and that's what God asks us to do, is on this journey, we can always learn more about him. God is so incredible. There is more every day that we can learn about him. No matter how close we are to him, we can get closer and we can learn more. And the same is true when we're looking at relationships and looking at marriages. No matter where your marriage is, no matter where your family is, no matter how old your kids are or your grandkids, you can always learn more to impact them in a positive way. And that is such a blessing to them, and it's a blessing to you as well. So the evaluation, the question is, do you need to put on your own oxygen mask first? Do you need to look at that? Are there some things that you need to take care of yourself before you can do your part in being the keeper of the family God's way? I want to end with one of the many fear not scriptures. I've heard, that there's a fear not scripture for every day of the year. I haven't tested that out. I've heard it. I like it because God says fear not, right? In Isaiah 41:13, it says, "For I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, fear not, I would help thee. I will help thee." You see, I believe that if we recognize a problem and take it to the Lord, repent if we need to, be humble about it, walk in faith, he's going to show us, and he'll lead us to whatever needs to be done. And it says here that he'll hold our right hand. The right hand symbolizes what? Symbolizes power. And what that means is that he will give us the power to do whatever needs to be done as long as we keep plugged into him as the power source. I believe that our families deserve our very best. It's not right that we go out at work and we're nice to our coworkers, we're nice to the people that serve us at the stores, and we go home and growl at our families. Our families deserve our very best, and we have to keep those priorities in mind. And God makes a way for that to be possible. So, if you want to stand, and we will dismiss for the evening. Lord, we thank you today, God, for the opportunity that we have to serve you and to know you, Lord, and to strive always, each and every day, to be better, God, knowing that you are the source and that you have such a desire and such a love for us. We thank you and honor you, Lord, in everything that we do. Teach us and train us. Help us to be the very best that we can be, Lord, for you, in your precious name. Amen. Thank you so much.